What is up, my veggies? My name is VTR, and welcome back to another VTR Breakdowns episode. Today we're going to be doing a little different thing. We're going to be looking at video game controllers. Specifically, we're only going to be looking at the controllers that I own. So, what controller are we going to start with? Perfect! So yes, technically this is not a controller. This is the Nintendo Switch Grip. But I want to talk about it even though I don't have my Joy-Cons with me. I wanted to talk about it anyway. So this thing actually fits very comfortable in the hands, especially when the Joy-Cons are actually in here. And I don't use this thing very often, but when I do use it, it's something I really enjoy. I prefer to use the Joy-Cons in handheld mode or just individually. But like for games like maybe like a fighting game or something like that, this works a lot better than playing it with a single Joy-Con. Now let's take a look to a classic, the NES controller. This thing just feels so nice in the hands. It's just completely so small, but some people complain about the ridges jigging into their hands, but I've never really had that issue. It really just worked. The D-pad is so great and responsive. I'm not a big fan of the plus and select button, the start and select buttons. But the buttons here just listen to that click. It's so nice. It's so nice. Now this next one's a little strange to talk about because this is the Atari Plug and Play, but it's the closest thing I have to the original Atari. So from what I know, this thing is extremely stiff. Like, you may not be able to tell on camera, but this thing is so stiff. The button here, it's not very satisfying to push. And it's just extremely, extremely stiff. It's just not very comfortable to play with. And that was a lot of problem with the original Atari as well, but I can't compare much to the original Atari with this controller. So here we got a Sega Genesis controller, which isn't a normal Sega Genesis for a normal Sega Genesis. It's one of those like cheap white consoles you can get for like $50 that have a whole bunch of games in it. They're officially licensed by Sega and everything, but like they're just not like the best. But because like obviously this thing has to use an AR sensor, which as you can see, that's what really is indicating when you press the buttons. And it's like the buttons are all fairly nice, and the D-pad may not be the best. Also, if you listen to that loud, plasticky sound, but the buttons here are pretty satisfying to press. I know there are like multiple versions of this controller, but this thing, it does feel decent in the hands. But for some reason, it's like the corners, I don't know why they feel strange to me, but it's definitely an odd controller nonetheless. Now this controller is for the Atari Flashback. This thing fixes a lot of the problems that I have with the original Atari controller. This is, I believe, for the Atari 2600, or I don't know, don't quote me, I don't know exactly. But it's definitely, see the buttons on the side I really like. It fits really nice in the hand. It feels like a TV remote. The clicks and the buttons really just like have a weird sound to me. But everything else about this controller really is great. Like the stick, like you can tell, it's like not meant to go too far. You're not supposed to be able to throw it too far, and it definitely has restriction of how far it can go. But if you push it too far, it's obviously going to break. But it's pretty light, and it's actually a pretty decent controller if you ask me. Sliding into our next controllers are the Oculus Quest 2 controllers. These things are so comfortable when you're playing a virtual reality game. The triggers on the back and on the side are so satisfying to press. You got the joysticks that work tremendously, and also the sensors in there that can sense where your thumb and some of your fingers are. It's really neat technology, and controllers work so well. They track the movements are tracked so well with these things from the headset, and they feel so nice in the hands. Now I can't talk about the Quest controllers without bringing up these. Obviously I have two of these for the PlayStation VR, but let's talk about that one by itself at first. since this thing was originally built for the PS3 for PlayStation Move games, but then eventually became the controller for the PlayStation VR, which what we know will not be the situation for the next iteration of PlayStation VR. But if you look up here, as you can tell, that's a port. Normally, you would have the original port for the PS3. But this thing, from what this thing does, from my experience, I've never played it with a PlayStation Move game, but I've only done with VR. These things, they track pretty darn decently. Like, the tracking can get bad because it's just following a camera, and it tracks the lights, which does track it pretty well, but there is some issues with these controllers. The tiny buttons, obviously, are responsive. This button is probably my favorite part of the whole controller. It does feel weird, but like for certain games, this thing works very well. I don't hate this thing. It definitely was a gimmick when it first came out, but now these things are really, really nice. Now, I'd be lying to you if I told you I knew what this thing was called. This is like something that goes with the PlayStation Move, and it's got a joystick up here and an X and circle button and a D-pad, which I think this thing would have been very beneficial to do with the VR. I haven't actually used this thing. I got it at GameStop for like 50 cents, like not even joking. I thought it was something cool I could own. It's got the PlayStation button here, and I really think for VR, this thing would have been very beneficial. You'd have one of these. You'd still put the little ball up here so I can track, but you'd be able to walk with this. And I think, because this feels so natural to me. It feels normal. It doesn't feel out of place. And I imagine these things would work coincide together on the PS3. But this thing is a really neat novelty, and I actually am pretty glad to own it. Now, mentioning the PlayStation Move, you got to bring up the Wii controller. Obviously, I have this one in a Wii jacket. But the Wii controller it was a gimmick done right. This thing got so many people to buy a Wii. It's such a simple controller with the D-pad up here, the A button, and the 1-2 buttons over here. And not to mention, most games would require also having the nunchuck, which also is a pretty decent little accessory. And obviously you could hold them with either hand you prefer. The nunchuck is a very simple thing with the buttons on the back, and also has slight motion controls. With this is the original model of the Wii controller. I don't have a Wii Motion Plus controller, but this is actually, the speaker in this thing is actually pretty dog crap. But besides that, this stuff is actually really nice, and I enjoy using them all the time. Except for them forced motion controls in games that don't need it. Keeping up, going with Nintendo's next console, the Wii U. Which was, you can guys see me in the screen, but this thing was definitely panned, and people did not like this thing at all. Well, but the Wii U ultimately failed, and this is mostly seen as a bad gimmick. But personally, this thing for me feels so great in the hands. The buttons are so responsive and so nice, and nothing really feels wrong to me. And you even got the little AI thingy or whatever you call it for the amiibo. And it's just a really nice controller. I love using this thing. I prefer this to the Switch. Yes, kill me. But I just love this controller so much. Our next controller is the television remote. Wait, what? Our next controller was a PS2 controller, which actually was my very first console. This thing is just still, it holds up very well. These joysticks are just so, they click right back into place. That sound is so nostalgic. And the triggers are not as good as on some of the other PlayStation models, but it's definitely stiffer, and a lot of the buttons are just not as good, but definitely a controller for the ages. And our next controller, you're probably just thinking, that's just another PS2 controller. You would be forgiven for thinking that, but no, this is a third-party PS2 controller, which actually has a lot to talk about, more than I would actually think it would. First things first, these joysticks are so much more stiffer than the original. Like, they're much, like, you feel like you're putting a lot of force into moving that. And the buttons just feel so weird. They have that bootleg. These feel mostly the same, but this thing really feels, you get that bootleggy charm, but like everything about this is just, it just removes the Sony stuff. It legit just removes the Sony stuff, and it looks like the plastic is obviously looks cheaper, but it's a good little alternative if you need an extra. I don't remember the brand, but it's just a cheap little PlayStation 2 controller. Next up is the PS3 controller. This thing fixes a lot of the issues, and yeah, mine's a little beat up. Fixes a lot of issues that the PS4 has, and PS2, sorry. Things aren't as loud and clicky. Some things just actually work a lot better. Like these aren't as stiff, they're a little more loose, but not too loose. And I even like the new home button, which is a lot nicer, because obviously there wasn't like an interface that we really had on the PS2, so we really didn't need a home button, but having a home button here, and it looks very nice, and obviously they would implement this onto a lot of their controllers. The logo in some way, shape, or form would be on the controller, and this would also come back on the PS4. It would just look slightly different. And just like the PS2, I have a third-party PS3 controller, which honestly, a lot of the time when I plug in my PS3, I wind up using this more. It may be a wired controller, but it's definitely, these are a lot stiffer. They remind me a lot of the bootleg PS2 controller, but everything else is pretty nice and pretty decent. Some of it feels weird. I don't know what the turbo and clear buttons do. But you got everything else here. But this is a rubber thing instead of a piece of plastic. The X, triangle, circle, all these buttons are slightly different, but mostly, and the biggest difference is these. If you look at this compared to this, like those are long, but something about them feels so nice in the hands. I don't know what it is, but I really do enjoy this controller, and it's one of the main controllers I use to play PS3 games. Unless there's motion controls, then I have to use this bad boy. But I mostly prefer to use this thing just because of the more comfortable design. And last but certainly not the least, the PS4 controller. This thing is so nice. I love everything about this controller, from the touchpad to the joysticks. It's all well balanced. It's just so satisfying to press anything on this controller. The buttons, the start, the home, everything on here. Even got a little home button, but it looks a little more modern-esque, and it just looks like a great controller. Obviously, it doesn't hold up. It holds up pretty well, actually. Even with the PS5 being a thing now, this controller is still, you get a little more resistance with the triggers than in the original, which the PS5 would definitely elaborate on that whole resistance thing, depending on the game and all that. But this thing is so nice. It's got a little bit of heft to it. There's a lot of stuff in here. You got like the dual shock, and obviously it's this really nice controller. And I literally love using this thing. And that is basically it for all my controllers. See, these controllers are definitely something. Controllers are something we can, as gamers, some of us take for granted. Like, we let them get destroyed. They're not as handled as well. I have a few examples here of some of mine not being taken care of so well, but I definitely take care of them a lot more. Like, obviously, I can show you an example right here of a Wii controller that it's missing its back. I'm pretty sure this Wii nunchuck doesn't even work. And obviously, I didn't show it earlier, but my PS3 controller has seen better days. And obviously, this controller is also missing its back battery thing. But all these controllers are still nice to use. Some of them are a little less enjoyable to use than others. But this is just, they're very just nice controllers, and they're really fun to use, and there's just not really anything to hate about any of these controllers. Even the third party ones, the main thing I have with some of them are some just the D-pads and the analog sticks are some of the different, like, but like I said, the PS4 is a perfect balance between almost a perfect controller. And I wish I could have talked more about the Joy-Cons. I was only able to really talk about the Joy-Con grip. I really wish I could have talked more about the Joy-Cons themselves, but this is all I can talk about. And obviously some stuff I couldn't go into elaborate with because I really actually haven't used it and don't have any games to use it for, and that would be this thing. I would really want to use this. I don't know what would be used. Could be used for. Maybe Heavy Rain if I still had it on PS3. But who knows what this thing can be used for. Maybe I can find a way to test it out one day in the future. And it's just a lot of these controllers are just really nice controllers, and I recommend most of them. If you've never used them, obviously you've got some of the game changers for game controllers like this. Like no one would have thought to see a controller be like this years ago. And like for Pete's sake, if this spawned this, and this thing became a pretty good VR controller, even though like a lot of people thought this thing was just a gimmick. And not to mention, this thing could have definitely been elaborated on, which I'm actually going to talk about in a video in the future. Definitely could have been a lot better than what it was. And you could have put a ball on top of this, and they could have done this for this. I don't know why they didn't do that. That would have been a much better thing, because that's basically what these are with the joysticks and everything, and that's why I like these so much. But that's it. All I have to say for this video, guys. I really hope you guys enjoyed, and same time next week, you guys will get another VTR breakdowns. We'll see you guys in the next one. Bye.